Welcome and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this informative webinar on cannabis stocks. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on Biltmore Capital Advisors. We are an independent, SEC-registered investment advisor based in Princeton, New Jersey, and Boca Raton, Florida. And we've worked with families all across the country. You can see some of the financial planning and asset management services we offer on your screen. Now, on to our presentation. Our presenter today is Dr. Donald R. Chambers, Chief Investment Officer of Model Portfolios here at Biltmore Capital Advisors. Dr. Chambers is a noted author and speaker on finance and investments. He has published 5 books and over 50 articles. Please feel free to type in any questions while the seminar is in session, and Dr. Chambers will try to answer as many questions as he can when the presentation is complete. I'll turn it over to Dr. Chambers now.
Thank you, Thalia, and thank you for everybody joining in. This is going to be an interesting seminar, at least from my perspective, because it's a kind of a backwater area as opposed to the mainstream asset allocation issues that I usually talk about. I'm going to talk about cannabis stocks and the decision of whether or not to invest. And what I'm really going to try to accomplish here is to put it in a broader context of how one would make a decision of investing in any particular stock or industry. I thought this would be a good graphic to get started with. I want you to know that I don't have any conflicts of interest here. I'm not trying to encourage or discourage cannabis investing. I work on the model portfolios at Biltmore Capital, and the only holdings of cannabis that are in that that I am involved in personally or professionally would be the small portions that are part of a very well diversified portfolio that includes funds that have thousands of stocks in them, some of which have cannabis exposure. So the big picture here is that I like to think of, in the case of cannabis, thinking about 3 major issues that in my opinion are going to drive future performance. The issue of first mover advantages, I'll talk about what that means, talk about regulation, and then private versus public investment opportunities. By that, I mean public are the listed exchange-traded assets, and private investment opportunities are partnerships and small stocks that aren't traded on listed exchanges. Ordinarily, when we would think about talking about an investment opportunity like this, we would want to cover it on 3 levels: the economy level, the industry level, and then the firm level. You zero in more and more on an investment opportunity. So I wanted to start on talking about the economy level. When you look at an investment, you want to think about, well, what would be the effect if the overall economy were to do very poorly or very well over the next 5 to 10 years? How would that impact the investment? And in the case of cannabis, I think it would be a relatively minor effect. In other words, whether the economy shows another 11 years of phenomenal growth as it has in the last 11 years, or whether we go into a great financial crisis again, like we did in 2007 and 2008, it may affect the stock prices a little bit, cannabis stock prices a little bit, but evidence shows that, for instance, stocks that focus on beer are rather immune to the economic and the business cycle. They tend to, even though the stock prices may respond a little bit, they tend to show good profitability, that people do continue to drink beer no matter how bad the times get. In fact, they might even increase beer consumption. And I think the same is true of cannabis. So I wouldn't consider this to be strongly correlated with the economy, but that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of risks. The risks are at the industry and firm levels. Is the cannabis industry in the US going to do well or poorly? And is the particular firm or investment within that industry going to do well or poorly? And that's what I'll be focusing on in my comments. As I reflected on at the industry level, I thought about, well, what might be in store for the cannabis industry? And my mind immediately went to previous experiences of legalization in the cannabis industry. And although legalization might be the wrong word, really decriminalization might be a better term to use, and in the Netherlands. And I've been to Amsterdam, and I was interested in this from an investment viewpoint, understanding this. Cannabis, marijuana has been largely decriminalized in Holland for years. And its current state is kind of illustrated in these three pictures that I have here. I have a picture in the upper right-hand corner here of a rather gaudy smoke house cafe, and I thought that was what it was going to look like. But there are very few of these, but there are some of those. There are also some coffee houses, coffee shops, which are illustrated in the lower left-hand corner, that are clue in that they're really focusing on marijuana users in those institutions, but they're rather rare. They're not at all as prevalent as, for instance, as to bars. Interesting point is, and I illustrate this in the bottom right corner here, is that you'll see these signs that marijuana smoking is not permitted, and that's at the bars. Most bars have signs out in front of them saying no marijuana smoking is allowed in those bars. Now, I'm not sure if that would apply towards edibles, but it's clear that these are two worlds that, at least commercially, are quite separated. And I think that this speaks volumes of what we might be expecting in the US in the next 20 to 30 years, if indeed cannabis continues on its path road to becoming mainstream. And that is that it's not going to be highly visible in public. This sign right here is about not being able to smoke marijuana in a public place, in a park. And I'm not sure, again, if that really is as much anti-marijuana as it is anti-smoking. But the point is that it doesn't seem to have become this behemoth industry in Holland, and I don't think it's going to become a behemoth industry in the United States. That having been said, just as a reference point, the cost of a casual user of marijuana at current price levels is somewhere around $3 to $5. That would be somebody who hasn't developed a high tolerance, $3 to $5 a day. That would be somebody that hasn't developed a high tolerance and they want just a moderate high. If you go towards a pothead, which the analogy might be an alcoholic, you could be talking about somebody that would be doing $20 or $30 of marijuana smoking a day, probably obtaining it through illegally as opposed to the more high-priced legal pathway. So the market could be rather huge. If we think of it as somewhat like alcohol consumption, the alcohol industry in the United States is massive. Wouldn't we expect that to happen in the United States? And I think the answer is no. It didn't happen in Holland, and I doubt it's going to happen here, that it's going to become large. Nevertheless, I think there are profit opportunities. But that, to me, is really driven by what is known throughout investments as the first mover advantage, that if somebody can be the first to get in on an investment opportunity that turns out to be worthwhile, they tend to make the lion's share of the profits. And it's the people who come after the first mover advantage who certainly don't gain any special opportunities, and in fact, they might be suffer bad returns when the first wave of successful returns is over with. So first mover advantage is to those people who are smart enough or lucky enough. It's not clear that people are just always receive these windfalls by being smart. A lot of times that it's just because they're lucky. I think of entrepreneurs, the same thing. They happen to be in the right place at the right time. So if you have that ability to get in on the ground floor at the right time early, before the knowledge of the opportunity is widespread, then there can be tremendous returns. Well, that ship has sailed in cannabis as far as I'm concerned from a broad perspective. Now, could there be narrow opportunities to be a first mover in a way in this industry somewhere geographically in the United States? And I think the answer is yes. But it's not going to be easy, like shooting fish in a barrel. So a problem in my mind with cannabis is the tremendous legal or litigation or regulatory risks, whatever words you want to use to describe them. I'm just amazed, perplexed, I should say, actually, by living in a world now where mayors and others, cities are outlawing large sodas. There's a huge attack on smoking and nicotine, now flavored vaping. I had to add that to the slide. That's such a new thing that's where the regulators are becoming involved. They're outlawing plastic straws. And at the same time that we get this groundwell of legislation and regulation and fining and litigation with regard to issues that I never thought would be attacked, we're moving in the direction of legalizing or at least decriminalizing marijuana. And that's perplexing to me. And I have to wonder whether this is going to be a pendulum. And at some point, the pendulum will switch the other way and there will be this big clamp down on the industry. So I would be concerned that this is a temporary phenomena, that the pendulum will swing back the other way. And I'm also very concerned that even if cannabis remains decriminalized and becomes popular in the United States, that doesn't mean that companies that are behind this will not be attacked legally. Look at the attack on tobacco companies. They certainly didn't force anybody to smoke. Alcohol companies through prohibition back in 100 years ago. And what's very scary to me is the way that pharmaceuticals, opioid manufacturers right now are being attacked. Johnson & Johnson and others, these massive attacks on them when they were providing a legal product that was highly regulated. There seems to be this bloodthirst, in my opinion, to go after pockets of wealth in any way in which they can be tainted. And I would consider this is always going to be a risk with cannabis, that whatever company it is, if it's a pocket of wealth, it might be attacked. So long story short, first mover advantage is probably largely speaking gone for any listed investments. When I say listed or public investments, I mean the same thing. These are stocks traded on major exchanges. And when I talk about private investments, I'm talking about limited partnerships or stocks that are not widely regulated and traded on exchanges. The legal risks, in my opinion, may be huge. So let's look at the performance of public cannabis stocks, publicly traded cannabis stocks. Long story short, there were a lot of early gains and it's given way at best to some volatility. So let's look at the firms right now. This is, if you were to go and do a web search on an index of cannabis stocks, this is what you'd come up with, ranked from largest to smallest. And notice the first one is Anheuser-Busch. Why? Because they're thinking that infusing THC, the active ingredient and primary active ingredient in marijuana, into beverages might be a medium of the future. AbbVie is a pharmaceutical. Altria, of course, is Philip Morris. And we get to the first one, Canopy Growth Corporation, that is just really devoted to marijuana. But I want to be clear about this. This is listed on the Toronto Exchange. If you look over to the left, the ticker is WEED in Toronto, and it's just traded in the United States. This is not a U.S. company. This is a Canadian company. Well, why don't we have a U.S. company? And the answer is because marijuana is still federally illegal. So you can't federally register a firm that's devoted towards marijuana growth. So the exposure to marijuana is coming through plays into the future on companies that are just supplying components of it. And Molson, of course, brewer. And then we get down to Aurora Cannabis, even though it doesn't indicate it, that is also a Toronto firm. That's a Canadian firm. I think it's headquartered in Edmonton. Its ticker symbol in the United States, it trades as ACB. It also trades in Toronto as ACB. So this is a Canadian company. Then Miracle-Gro, that's a U.S. play. And finally, we get down to some companies that might be specifically geared towards a major part of their business being in the U.S. Another view of these companies is here, where I've listed the trading volume. I pulled the screenshot out. And what I wanted to illustrate here is the tremendous trading volume that we see relative to the size of these relatively small companies. So as a reference point, I've listed that UPS, this huge US stock worth $80 billion, only has $300 million a day in trading. And some of these tiny firms here have almost $100 million in trading. So they're right now obviously the object of tremendous speculative trading, if you ask me. This is a long-term performance. And I think we have to use the term long-term in quotes here, because long-term for this industry is pretty short. The best picture I was able to get was from back maybe 4 years ago. And what it does illustrate is that there has been a rise here. This is a huge increase from 3 years ago to this high. But if we go to the next slide, it illustrates a shorter term view. This is cut off in August or so, and it's been nothing but downhill since then. If this graph were continued to be shown, it would go down here. So what it really illustrates is that we've kind of passed, in my opinion, that first mover advantage in terms of a global industry exposure in the United States. And although there might be individual opportunities that are great, we seem to be in a period of very high volatility, but not necessarily a direction, although the direction in the past 6 months has been very, very negative. So these are huge variations from 50 up to 125, probably back down to around 50. One thing I also wanted to mention is the term I'm going to use is Goliaths, that we have these Goliath firms like Anheuser-Busch. So if we speak of cannabis exposure in a well-diversified portfolio, it's going to come through these huge conglomerates. It's not going to be occurring through these unless you specifically seek out the small companies. So there is a U.S.-focused fund, YOLO, that came out about 5 months ago that tried to say that we are going to focus through derivatives on cannabis exposures within the United States, as opposed to the way that other companies are getting exposure through Canadian firms. And if you look at the price here, it opened up at $25 a share, and it's trading down now at half of its price. So half of the money has been lost in this. It's been a bad market for cannabis in the past 3 to 4 months. And I think it's going to continue to be a very volatile market, although I don't know the direction. When we talk about investing in cannabis, there's a variety of places you can invest, and I thought this was an excellent illustration of those. 3 areas that you can actually be touching the plant. These are the people that are actually growing the marijuana, the technology, the cultivation, and processing them into the actual products. These tend to be small companies that are doing this in the United States. Then there's the companies that can be providing support services directly to the marijuana concepts, agricultural technology, real estate specifically designed towards marijuana use. These are companies that are specifically targeting the marijuana market, but they're not literally touching and processing the plant. They're providing the facilities or the capabilities to do that. And then there are other firms who provide services to a variety of industries, including the cannabis industry. And there might be some plays there that they might have some good opportunities to expand their ordinary line of business into a broader marketplace. Will the advantages be realized by the Davids or the Goliaths? I think that the opportunities are more with the Davids, the small firms, than with the huge firms. And I think maybe the best opportunity, just to shoot from the hip here, and this is not my expertise, is that you might want to consider trying to get involved in a venture that is doing the cultivation, the actual growing of the marijuana, and processing it into the products, or the retail distributions in newly decriminalized locations. That might be some opportunities there. Which brings us to the problem. And the problem is that those opportunities are going to be private opportunities. Now, by a private opportunity, these would be limited partnerships where, unless you have a direct access to the inside track, you would be a limited partner, or a mezzanine exposure in a corporation. This would be a preferred stock exposure. So I list this as a partnership structure. It could also be a stock, an equity structure, where there's some inside shareholders, there's some preferred stock shareholders, and then there's some debt providers. Or in the case of a partnership, these would be the general partners, these would be the limited partners, and these would be people that are making loans to the overall entity. Perhaps they have a mortgage on a real estate property, or they own the land in some other sort of operation. I've been involved in the investment industry for my entire career, almost 40 years, and these partnerships, these private structures, have substantial peril. I have seen so many people hurt so badly by these. The insiders are the ones that make the money. the outsiders rarely make as much money as they should given the risks that they take. I've tried to summarize this over here, that when a venture is formed, they will try to get some of the money through well securitized debt. If there's real estate involved, they'll have a mortgage on that property. The insiders will throw in a little bit of their money, and they will throw in their sweat equity. But they will be well paid for this. They're going to make sure that they get fees and salaries at the get-go. So their risk is actually not that high because, as I say, they're getting compensated. To me, the outsiders are the ones that so rarely win. It's just not something I want to be involved in. I get emails all the time, every day, multiple emails trying to get me to invest money on behalf of our investors in mezzanine deals. And I just consider them to be horrible deals. They'll offer maybe a 6 or an 8% return, and that sounds great, and they claim there's no risk. The risk is that when things go very badly, you'll be completely wiped out. And it's just not worth the risk in virtually every deal that I've seen. The fees are just unbelievable. And I'll talk about that here. If you actually look at I'm talking now in the context of a limited partnership deal, which is the typical small private deal. They have a limited partnership agreement and other forms that will tell you what they're going to do with your money. And when you actually read them, they are just shocking of how badly the outside investor, you, the limited partner, are going to be treated. I've read tons of these in my life, and they're almost all written by the attorneys of the insiders. The insiders are the general partners who organize the ventures and manage them. And the agreements give every advantage to the inside investor and hurt the outside investor. There's an organization, great organization called the International Limited Partners Association, ILPA, that talks about how bad these agreements are. And I'm not just talking about the agreements that some fly-by-night outfit is peddling to small investors. I'm talking about the big partnerships that are even being offered to major institutions. They're just incredibly biased in terms of the way that the general partners can disproportionately assess fees to the limited partners, the way that they get such high amount of money with taking such small risk. I would never invest in one of these unless I knew the people involved. I had a personal connection. I could afford to lose every penny I put in. I read it, I understood it, and I had reason to believe that there was tremendous upside potential to the limited partners. Every time there's an asset class that does well, whether it's oil and gas or real estate, they'll come out with all sorts of these deals and they'll show how well it's done in the past 10 years. Well, yeah, that's when they start selling it to the outside investors. And these things are fraught with danger. But if there is any gold in the cannabis hill, mixing some metaphors here, I would say it is in these private deals. But how would one become involved, and how would one be able to pick that deal? And I wished I could do it in a 30-minute seminar. I'm not even sure I can do it at all, but I think I can certainly give some general things to think about. I've listed in this presentation can be emailed from Biltmore Capital if you wish to receive the presentation. And these are links to some good publications that I've found on the industry. A problem with getting really good information on the U.S. industry here again is because it's federally still illegal. So the normal flow of information that you would get with regard to firms and industry is not available because of it being federally illegal. And at this point, I've asked Thalia to see if there are any questions. Please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Chambers, for that wonderful insight. So we'll now do a little Q&A session, and we can address any questions that anyone has. Before the presentation, we did have a few people email us with some questions, so I'll go through those first with Dr. Chambers. So the first one we have is, are there any mutual funds that specialize in cannabis? And if so, which would you recommend?
Well, the answer is yes, there are. There are ETFs, exchange traded funds. Those are great vehicles to invest in stocks. But in this particular industry, there's a small number of them, just a handful, and they tend to have high expense ratios. They tend to have expense ratios around 75 basis points, which takes almost 1% of your money out each year for doing nothing other than assembling a portfolio of opportunities that you could buy for yourself. So it's hard for me to recommend a particular fund. I wouldn't recommend any of them. And remember that these these ETFs, except for this one, the chart I showed where they're using derivatives, they're just going to invest in listed stocks. And these listed stocks are mainly Canada. They're really not US focused. So there really isn't, in my understanding, a fund that I could recommend that is focused on this. Now, if you were to invest in a broadly based equity mutual fund, it's going to contain stocks, shares of Anheuser and Altria, and therefore you'll have a sliver of exposure to cannabis. So Biltmore clients that use the model portfolios that I oversee, they certainly have a sliver of exposure through those large stocks. But at this point, I don't think there's a way to get exposure that is attractive through anything other than attractive private deals. And that's the rub, is finding those out.
Great, thank you. Our next question. If marijuana is going to be legalized in more and more states, won't the higher sales and profit mean that marijuana companies overall should be good investments?
Well, there's the rub. Yeah, do we think that there's going to be more and more legalization? Yes. If you go into the web, you can find maps in which they project the dates at which each state is going to decriminalize or legalize marijuana. Remember, it's still federally illegal. So, but even though we know that, even though we know there's going to be many more states, it's highly likely there's going to be many more states and there's going to be much, much broader legal sales of marijuana. It doesn't mean that there's investment profits there. And that's the key, is that investments are valued based upon expectations. And there's already an expectation that marijuana is going to be broadly legalized throughout the US. So because that's already expected, it's already included in the shares prices, it's too late to profit from that viewpoint. That's what the first mover advantage is. If I'd known 5 years ago that the legalization would have spread this rapidly, that's where those early first mover profits were. But I didn't forecast that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And our final question here that we've received. If private investments are the ones with the better potential, how can someone find good private opportunities?
Well, that's another really that's the rub. How do we find these private deals? How do we get in on the ground floor of a cultivator or a retailer or somebody that services this industry in a way where we can get superior profit opportunities? And basically, my answer to that is you have to be in my opinion, you have to be some sort of an insider. The great deals are going to be offered to people that they know and love and trust. And the outside money, largely speaking, is going to be those participations are going to be sold to people that are going to be too late to enjoy the first mover advantage. So I wished I could say something much more encouraging and optimistic. And I guess the one thing I can say about that is that if you work hard in this and you search for places where the first mover advantage might be there, and you can find people that you can trust to be on the inside track of those investments, there might be some opportunities there. It's not for the faint of heart. This is very risky, and it's not for the naive. It's not for the optimistic. It's for somebody that has that experience. And that's not my specialty at Biltmore Capital. I'm an asset allocator. I think I understand how markets function, and I don't have the interest or frankly the expertise in evaluating these very specialized, unique opportunities in cannabis.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chambers. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We will be sending out an email within the next day or so that has a link to watch this webinar in case you missed any part of it. And for more information on Biltmore Capital, please visit www.biltmorecap.com, and also go ahead and like and follow us on Facebook at Biltmore Cap to stay on top of all our future webinar events as well as industry relevant news. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful day.